When you come together with people who have different ideas, one idea and another idea should not equal two ideas, they should equal better ideas. And the keystone for developing civil discourse is intellectual humility. That's the starting point.
Pano, welcome to 12 Geniuses.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here.
Tell us who you are and how you've journeyed to the University of Austin.
In many ways, I'm a creature of higher education. I was a first-generation college student. I come from a Greek family, immigrant family. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in English and creative writing. I was going to be a poet. That was my first career path. Not one that I took for a short while, but then I went back to graduate school and did an MA in political philosophy, and then a PhD in literature focusing on Shakespeare at University of Chicago, and then went into teaching. I was a professor for quite a number of years, started as a postdoc at Stanford, then University of San Diego, Loyola University. Then I became a dean at Valparaiso University of that honors college, a kind of great books honors college called Christ College. Went on to become the president of the kind of platonic ideal of a great books education, St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. And after spending a wonderful 4 years there, I was convinced by a number of people, and I guess also by myself, that starting a new university would be a great adventure. And so that's what I'm doing now, beginning the University of Austin as the founding president.
Well, you and the University of Austin certainly seem to be disruptors in higher education. Do you agree? And what are some of the ways that you're trying to change expectations around education?
I agree. I think we're accidental disruptors, I guess is the way that I would say it, is that our intention isn't to create a disruptive university, but to, let's say, return to the roots of higher education, especially American higher education, and kind of returning to the historical rootedness of the American higher education system, of these institutions. It feels disruptive. I mean, the word revolution actually means to circle back to the beginning, to revolve. That's the root. And most revolutions have a sense that they're kind of returning to something that's been lost along the way, lost in translation. So I feel in many ways that's sort of what we're doing. And I guess the way that I would characterize it is that I think American universities are unlike universities anywhere in the world. In the United States, the university system grew with the country. Everywhere we started new cities or states or counties, we planted universities. And those universities were themselves the kind of engines of development, of progress, they were the seed beds for the intellectual life of the country. They were very productive places. They were intended to be places that shaped civic values and civic leaders, that played a very direct role in cultivating the kind of the kind of spirit of independence and enterprise that was kind of at the heart of the American endeavor. So radically different than a university like Cambridge or Oxford that is part of a essentially aristocratic society with, for the most part of its history, a kind of one church state. American universities were totally heterogeneous. Everywhere you went, there was a small college, and that college was often denominationally oriented, reflecting the people who had settled in that area. Or there was a state land grant university. It was meant to kind of drive innovation and entrepreneurship. So one of the things we're trying to do is just go back and say, what if you think of a university as a place that's meant to foster builders and creators and innovators, and also engender a sense of civic responsibility and communal connectedness? What would that university look like? And so that's the university we're building now.
The main thing that we're trying to do with this episode is to understand how we can better cultivate communication online and on our campuses. And I'm wondering in what ways you have seen communication and tolerance of different ideas on campuses changing over the course of your career.
It's interesting. I mean, I think there's this kind of meme that, universities have become these, hotbeds of where Marxist professors are trying to corrupt the youth and push into their heads ideas that are traumatizing for let's say for American civic life and that. And I think that's a kind of cartoonish version of what's actually. I think there's some truth in there. I mean, I think universities have probably always leaned to the left, and have certainly been places where abstract ideological systems of thinking like Marxism and other theoretical frameworks have been welcomed and taken hold. But for me, it's not so much the kind of set of ideas that's in play. What's happened at universities is we've created these kind of monocultures where over time, you sort of see this with each generation of faculty and then each generation of incoming administrators. The aperture for like what ideas are, let's say, deserving of attention is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That there's a kind of dominant set of themes that are elevated and said to be the things that everybody should be thinking about and everybody should worry about. If you move in a different direction, you cut these crosswise, you're at best left out of the conversation, and at worst, punished or put at risk because you're introducing ideas into the conversation that, are not what is currently considered to be orthodox. And that has happened. And we see it in the data. I mean, 70% of college students say that they hold back in the classroom. Almost as many professors say the same thing. So I was watching over time the conversations at our universities constrict and get smaller and smaller and smaller, and therefore less interesting and then less valuable. And so finding a way to open up those conversations again so that, I guess I would put it this way, I think the heart, I'm a sort of hopeless Socratic, right? I believe that human beings learn by asking big questions and seeking to disrupt the things that we hold to be true. Doesn't mean they're not true, but we're always seeking to push and challenge the ideas that we kind of hold dearly. One of my mentors said we should have strong convictions lightly held. And I think that's a great way to think about it. So if this is how we learn, if this is how we grow, if this is how we come to understand the world, we have to create institutions that foster open inquiry and civil discourse. We just have to. I mean, we call ourselves Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens are the creatures that seek knowledge or seek to be wise. And this is just what we are engineered to be doing. And when we restrict, the kind of activity that leads to the discovery of knowledge, I think we sort of our souls shrink in some fundamental way.
That's a great segue to this next question, which is, in what ways do you see the University of Austin challenging the status quo in order to promote better communication and diversity of thought on campus?
One of the great joys of building a university from the ground up is you have kind of an open sandbox. You're like, okay, what do we want to build? Like, what is our castle going to look like? Or do we want to make a hippopotamus? Or what do you want to build with this material that you have? And I'll give you an example of how, let's say, within our curriculum, we have been thinking deeply about creating a culture of conversation. For the first 2 years, our students undertake almost exclusively what we call the Intellectual Foundations Program. And that is a series of courses that are designed to look at the great human questions from all different disciplines across the liberal arts: politics, philosophy, history, mathematics, the hard sciences, music, etc. And the courses are all taken in common by the students. So they all take the same courses together in the same sequence. They'll be in a smaller section, But that means that all of our students in each cohort are reading the same things at the same time. So they all might be reading, the Principia, or they might be reading Brothers Karamazov, or they might be reading Othello, or they might be reading Jane Austen, or whatever it is. And what that does is it means that group of students has a common intellectual journey. That the questions that they're thinking about as a cohort. And what happens there is that the experience in the classroom spills out to their experience at the university, right? So you have this kind of cross-pollination. You'll be sitting at, at the dining table, and somebody will be like, well, what do you think? Was Antigone right or wrong? We're talking about it in my section. You have the same point of contact, or, having that common intellectual journey, I think weaves together a community of truth seekers. They may have different opinions and different ideas about what's being discussed, but they have a touch point. And what happens at that point is when you start talking about the great human questions and thinking about the big things that matter together, you start to create a community of trust. And in creating that community of trust, when you get to those questions that are really vexing, the things that we're dealing with today, issues of race or gender or peace or that, you've already built a common vocabulary amongst yourselves and the ability to talk about important things. And so that, that circle of trust extends both within the classroom and outside, and it allows you to have conversations that maybe are difficult to have in the rest of the world where everybody remains fragmented.
Yeah, there's two things that stand out to me. One is you're creating this culture of curiosity and also simultaneously creating psychological safety. And one of the things that I think is really problematic in our society today is how much we know. And it's really not knowledge, it's beliefs. So we carry our beliefs and turn that into what we think is knowledge. And I see you kind of peeling that back. It's like, no, you don't need to know. You just need to explore, be curious, and you have this safe environment with which to have these conversations with other people.
Yeah, look, the groundwork for these kind of conversations is, let's say loosely what we'd think of as civil discourse. And civil discourse is not two people coming together shouting but not quite killing each other. That's not civil discourse. Civil discourse is the discourse or the conversation that builds civil society. So it's a productive way of thinking about conversation. It's not a debate, it's a discussion. And I often say that, when you come together with people who have different ideas, one idea and another idea should not equal two ideas, they should equal better ideas. And the keystone for developing civil discourse is intellectual humility. That's the starting point.
Mm-hmm.
If you can begin and say, look, we are all human beings, we're all trying to figure the world out. We make more mistakes than we'd ever care to admit about most things. We know some things. We think we know a lot more than we actually know. I'm at this institution to learn how to fill the gaps in my knowledge, and maybe to learn whether or not my knowledge is actually as stable as I think it is. If you begin with that sense of intellectual humility, again, and this goes back to Socrates, if you begin with intellectual humility, you open yourself up. And in opening yourself up, you allow yourself to come into contact with ideas that may be persuasive or may sharpen your own ideas. I think that's the kind of environment. And I would say it's not necessarily that you're psychologically safe, because in many ways it could be really distressing to have your ideas upended. It's not about psychological safety. It's more about the idea that you have confidence that everybody in the conversation is a good actor. And therefore, if you make mistakes, you're not going to be penalized for that in some disproportionate way. And so I think it's psychologically risky to allow yourself to be open to other ideas. And that kind of risk is what sharpens who we are. The mind is a muscle, and muscles can only be strengthened with tension, with resistance. If our mind only meets things that are things that we already agree with, the muscle goes slack. So we need that tension.
So much of our lives are lived virtually and online. And what can universities do to encourage free speech and safety online?
Look, I think the primary problem with online communication is that it's ultimately detached from the human experience, right? So when people are responding to each other online, they're not envisioning a fully three-dimensional human being who has all the worries and hopes and angst that they have themselves. They're looking at a kind of caricature of a human being that is just represented by an opinion that's posted somewhere. And so in order for us to, I think, let's say, reclaim what fully human conversation online, we have to have fully human conversation in person. The more that we actually interact with other people, the more that we dive into deep ideas together, the more that we trust other physical, real human beings in the world, the less likely we'll be able to forget that everybody at the end of, whatever chat room you're in or whatever comment area you're in, everybody is a fully dimensional human being. What the internet is I often call it, the internet is sort of society's id, right? It's the place where all the kind of stuff that we should be pushing down swells up. And, the id is supposed to be superintended, by the superego, which says, hang on, that goes too far, and that, don't do that, or somebody, but there's no superintending force on the internet because it's mostly anonymous. There's no consequence for being a kind of, for letting that darker stuff swell up, or at least not in most cases. So, we have to self-regulate. We have to be able to remember that, every voice is ultimately a human voice that we come in contact with, and that our words do have consequences.
Boy, that's a lot of muscle memory to overcome. Just to add a little levity here, but my goodness, that's we got to retrain.
We do, and here's the thing.
It's not just a generation.
No, and I think, as we obviously know, the impact on younger people is extraordinary because they've never lived outside of this kind of ambient social media environment. It's going to become even worse if we don't intervene. If we just don't say, look, we need to protect young people from the kind of, sonic miasma of social media by just keeping them away from devices. And or using them responsibly, or educating them about the perils. And I think I think we will see more and more of it. I think it's so self-evident to parents. I have teenagers. It's so self-evident how destructive social media is to human relations, that I think we will start to see, a kind of pushback, and hopefully over time we will start to unlearn some of the habits that we've learned.
I'm wondering what advice you have for Gen Z. So many of them are going to be casting their first ballots in a presidential election this fall. How can they learn to have more respectful dialogue about the issues that matter most to them? What's your advice to them?
Look, I think the first thing is to be as informed as you can humanly be. It's the sad thing is we know that we are at a point where the media presents to us extremely biased, one-sided views, whatever part of the political spectrum you're on. We know, we're self-aware that the information we're getting is limited, that it's self-selected, curated, and yet we get such a dopamine hit from reading things that we already agree with. And so be self-aware. Say, hey, I need to look at sources that disagree with the narrative that I'm comfortable with, and do that purposefully, and then take that to the human level and say, look, I may want to, I might be a Democrat and I'm inclined to vote for Biden, but I really am humanly curious about somebody who is interested in Trump. Let me go find a conversation. I have to have a friend or relative that, or vice versa. I think, the kitchen table conversations, the kind of mythical kitchen table conversations, have to be recovered. I find this with the younger generation in particular, this sort of sense like the game is rigged. And some people think it's rigged by one side, some by the other, some whatever it is. The game is rigged, that they have no voice no ability to contribute to the conversation. They're sort of overwhelmed with information overload, and it just creates this kind of just a sense of despair and checking out that takes away the agency that they should have. And that's tragic.
Well, one thing I will add to that is when I get into conversations with people who have different ideas from me, I can focus on trying to win or trying to learn, but I can't do both. So if I'm focused on winning, then I'm just going to try to minimize that individual's ideas or perspectives. But if I really want to learn from that person, I have to put aside, this idea that I have to be right. And that can be hard for me to do. I'm a competitive guy.
That's one of my own areas of discipline, is trying to listen better. Because what we often do is, and this happens at a seminar table, it happens in conversation with friends, somebody's speaking, we're not really listening to them.
That kind of leads me to this next question, which is, what are the ways that you as a leader and the other leaders on campus can demonstrate effective communication or encourage effective communication on campus?
Too often, we think that leadership is, a leader is somebody who has all the answers. That's the purpose of being a leader, right? The leader, like everybody's kind of confused, and then the leader ascends to the podium, and then boom, clarity. Like, here it is. This is what everybody needs to know. That's wrong. Leaders sometimes have good answers, but more often than not, the way to lead is to lead in conversation. Say, here's what we're thinking about. Here's what's important. Here's the mission of the school. Here's the challenges that we face. Here are the things that are on my mind. Here are my ideas. And then allow that conversation to kind of bloom from that. So I think a real leader, at least in a setting, in a university setting, is one who models and exemplifies a mode of dialogue. It doesn't mean you're not absolved of having to make decisions. You're not absolved of having responsibility for what happens. But you are absolved of having to be right all the time.
So we're going to take a left turn, maybe? I'm curious to know what you think that the college campuses are getting right about these divisive issues and what you plan to emulate.
It's kind of hard to answer that, because I think what we're seeing now through the media is just, every eruption as it's happening in real time. What we're seeing really is, I think, what is mostly anomalous on campuses.
Outliers.
Right, outliers.
Yeah.
And we're not sort of seeing the kind of true kind of daily kind of quotidian activity that happens on campuses.
And that's an indictment on the media.
I think it, of course, it's an indictment on all of us. Like, the media is the media. The media only puts out there what we ask for.
Yeah, you're right. We're consuming it too.
I mean, again, the media is something that transmits information. It's not, so I do think we are responsible as consumers of media. But in any case, what are schools doing well? Look, I think there is an increasing self-awareness that universities have, that they have to circle back to intellectual freedom, open dialogue, intellectual pluralism. I mean, I hear this all the time. We do, in general, need to restore the first principles of higher education. And the more that takes root, I think the more that we will see that these kind of like volcanic eruptions of illiberalism start to disappear.
Well, hopefully you won't have to deal with this, but what's your policy toward protesting on campus?
Look, I mean, I'm not original in our policy. I mean, I think there's absolutely clear lines, and it is, yes, people have a right to express their strongly held convictions about anything. They don't have a right to do it everywhere at all times in every manner possible, right? So you create an opportunity for people to express what they want to express, whether it's an area of campus or a time, or you put boundaries around it, and then with the goal in mind of, you know, that the operations of the university can't be disrupted, and you allow people to speak freely there. The other thing, you know, the other limits on speech, I think, are, you know, I think self-evident, that speech that directly calls for the harm of anybody is completely impermissible. And speech, I would say we're at a point where speech that obliquely calls for the harm of other people, that kind of hides behind slogans or catchphrases, but can be understood by people to be calling for harm, I think is, let's call it, dangerous adjacent, and should be, if not prohibited, confronted and strongly discouraged. The way I say is, like, look, we're looking in very volatile times. We don't have room for ambiguity. Say exactly what you mean, say it clearly, and let people respond to that. But let's not get cute and hide behind slogans or phrases that, you know, are reasonably understood by other people to be threatening.
What advice do you have for college students or soon-to-be college students related to what they should be expecting from a higher education experience? Because it seems like you're approaching that differently at the University of Austin.
Well, I think what they should be looking for in an experience at universities is they should be looking for places that are serious about the life of the mind, that are places where, you know, ideas are taken very seriously, that allow for intellectual pluralism, that welcome dissent, and in fact encourage intellectual risk-taking. Because those are the kind of institutions that are going to produce the leaders and builders and creators that we need. If our elite institutions attract students, and, you know, they have this history of attracting the quote-unquote best and brightest. If we take the best and brightest in the elite institutions and we tell them when they're there, you know, keep your opinion to yourself. It's a little dangerous if you argue against what other people are arguing against. If you feel, you know, uncomfortable with the things that you believe, it's better just to suppress that. If what we tell the best and brightest students, that the only way forward, the only way to success, and success through elite institutions is really about power, the only way to power is to conform and to keep quiet and not to take risks, we are causing ourselves civilizational harm, right? So what universities should be doing and what students should be looking for are places that are going to encourage them to think outside the box. They're going to reward them for having an innovative or entrepreneurial mindset. They're going to ask them to push against settled truths and incentivize them to do so. And, you know, to me, you know, for all the things that we hear in the news or all the things we read about that seem to be, you know, they have this kind of declensionist narrative that things are getting bad and they're always going to go bad, and they're always going to go in the wrong direction. You spend, you know, a day with our incoming freshman class, and you'll be very, very hopeful about the future.
Pano, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being a genius.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.